Sanskriti, you may start.
Yes. Hello, everyone. A very good evening to all of you. Today, I have with me Ms. Sanchita Ain, Advocate on Record, Supreme Court of India. And we have a webinar which is on the topic Forced Sterilization of Women with Disabilities. Now, when we talk about the subject forced sterilization, basically it brings our attention to the cultural and the sociological context in which women are subjected to sterilization. Sterilization is basically a procedure, a medical one, like, to regulate reproductive rights on women. Now it has been debated much and also a controversial topic. Today, ma'am will be dealing with the sociological criteria, history, like, from where is it originated, what is the significance, and what are the laws associated with post-sterilization, especially women in India with disabilities. So over to you, ma'am. A very good evening to you.
Thank you so much, Sanskriti. Thank you. So what I'll do is I'll focus more on the legal aspects. And if somebody has questions on sociological aspects, you can take those as well. Because there's so much to talk about when we talk about the whole regime of consent and how do we resolve it. So I think I would like to throw some light on it. But before going into that, I would also like to share with you what made me think about this topic. Right. So when I was in school, I was in Calcutta at that time, and I used to travel by bus every day. I used to travel for an hour. So I would see many, I think you also get to see people with mental illness on the streets and you wonder where they come from. Under what circumstances were they thrown out or did they just leave? And then there was this woman who was constantly beating herself up, and I could make out that she was pregnant and that she was in pain, and that's why she was constantly beating herself up. So that made me think, what should be done? Should anything be done? Are we supposed to decide what should be done?
Right.
And how does she get to decide? So this is like something that happened when I was in school, and then I went to college, and then I went to study international human rights law at University of Essex, where I got to work with the ex-special rapporteur on right to health, Professor Paul Hunt. And he had a very special interest in reproductive rights. That's when I got to discuss a lot with him. So I thought I'll share with you my insights on it. So the first aspect, so let's just first look at since I'm talking about the international law and how I got to discuss with an ex-special rapporteur. So therefore, let's start from there. Let's start from seeing what international law thinks on the issue before we come to the domestic law, which is of a very, very recent origin. So first, let's start with international law here. So law on forced sterilization, again, this is something, forced sterilization generally, you saw eugenics, you saw how it was being used. People thought that we do not want imbeciles, right? And therefore,
Yes.
yeah. So we saw all that. We saw how Nazis used it later. But that's a separate issue, and we're not getting into that. We evolved as a society, and we realized that this is not done. Then came the issue of forced sterilization generally as a birth control measure, right? That's also a little distinct, and that's a very, very distinct issue when we think in terms of to what extent can the state control whether you want to have another child or not. That's another issue, irrespective of gender. Then comes another issue as to sterilization of, say, generally people with disabilities, right? But that doesn't happen to the extent women with disabilities are forcibly sterilized, because it's difficult for the caregivers to maintain menstrual hygiene. That's primarily the reason why. And I think one of the motivating factors behind picking up this topic would also be that at some stage, I I have a condition that could have led to, I could have been bedridden. So then again, that made me think whether I will have a free consent or whether I would be thinking for my caregivers, just random thoughts that you have. So therefore, it's not just a woman with mental disability, but women with disabilities in general who are subjected to this. So whether or not the consent is free has always been an issue and will remain an issue because they're so dependent on the caregivers. So this is, of course, the social context in which it operates. But when we talk about law, let's see what Human Rights Committee thinks about it. So Human Rights Committee considers it as torture. Forced sterilization is a form of torture, cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment, right? And if somebody's punished, then even that comes within the definition. If somebody's punished with, say, forced sterilization, that comes within the definition as well. The Committee Against Torture has also implicitly considered forced sterilization for Roma women. So it was in context of Roma women that it also constitutes violation of conventional. So that we know that it is something that's not something that's very indirect, etc. It's a very direct form of torture against a woman.
Yes.
So it's also a form of violence, and that has been widely recognized. Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women has considered forced sterilization as a form of sexual violence. CEDAW committee again and again, they have emphasized on countries to have their own distinct law that will prevent forced sterilization, that will punish people who commit, and to provide compensation to women who have gone through such a form of violence.
Yes.
Right. In fact, CEDAW committee makes a very useful observation. So you'll find it in concluding observations on various countries, but one that really stands out, how to get to consent. I mean, there has to be a mechanism as well. So CEDAW committee at some point wanted this the state to adopt legislative changes clearly defining the requirements of free, prior, and informed consent. So it's not just making somebody sign a consent form or just telling them, you know what, if I do this procedure on you, you'll be free from menstruation, something that sort. People can be made to believe that it's going to have some sort of advantage while they are not being told that what will be the implications, right? So it says that there has to be a period of at least 7 days to think, right? Between informing the patient about the nature of the sterilization, its permanent consequences, potential risks, and available alternatives. I think it's very, very important when getting a consent that all of these should be stated. And that's generally true for any other procedure as well, something that we find is lacking, and there should be a definite mechanism to ensure that this is being.
There is a system to regulate this thing.
That's right. That's right. Your mother is a doctor, so I'm sure you have certain observations.
I was actually coming to that only, that we are sitting here, we are privileged enough with our education, with our awareness, with our degrees, to know about sterilization, to know about the process of sterilization, and we know how painful it is an experience, as well as how there is a need to stick to laws. But there is a big strata of society who is not aware about what itself in sterilization is, and what are the mechanisms that regulate the process of the whole sterilization. In fact, they don't even know what their reproductive rights are. While they go to a gynecologist, there is much taboo surrounding the topic, with concern to women's health. They don't even know what to ask and how to ask. So especially when we are discussing the very topic of forced sterilization, I really want to know how the situation especially in India is with respect to forced sterilization, and what can women do more about it to be aware about this the whole issue.
See, the problem is we as a society, we are not aware that this issue exists, because we, just like domestic violence, I mean, it took us years to recognize that
Centuries.
we need a law on the point, and that it cannot be decided within the four walls. If a woman is being violated, if a woman is being even emotionally abused, financially abused, she has the right to redressal, right? Even if it's against her own father or her own brother or husband, right?
Basically,
Similarly,
her own.
important to acknowledge this as an issue, and a very, very serious one. It violates the integrity of the person when a procedure of this sort is performed, which has permanent consequences. And a woman who is, can you imagine a woman with disability? She's so dependent on the caregiver
Everything.
that he may not have a say. It's like
Not at all.
yeah. So I think we also do not know. How many of us knew that this issue exists, that there are women with disabilities who are being forced to get sterilized? And I think it's so common that we don't even think it's an issue. It's like
Just
we are
any
more,
other section of the society that they just pass through, or whenever there is a discussion on the table, they tend to avoid it, or something that they say that you don't need to know about it. If something is surrounding my gender or not, I need to know about that particular thing. What is the issue surrounding it? Like,
so it's something where we think more in terms of what the caregiver is going through while maintaining the menstrual hygiene of the person. And therefore, it's okay to do it. We're thinking more in terms of convenience of the caregiver, and therefore we do not think it to be an issue at all. That also happens. That's at the background. We think that this is something that's understood, just like because the caregiver gets to decide then, because
everything, every aspect of the whole process.
Right. Right. Therefore, it makes the issue much more complex. And that's why we don't even get to hear about it. Just like, if you think about domestic violence a few decades back, now we can't even imagine that being the discourse, that people would say, oh, it's for the husband, it's something to be decided among themselves. We are nobody to say anything about. Right? Or the peace and whatever of the family is more important. The family is more important. The integrity of the family is more important than a woman seeking a right to redress.
Their integrity, their whole thing comes into the picture, like, what the family will be said or talked about on the table when they talk about such things. Forget about that. Mothers don't tell their daughters about the basic hygiene, about the menstrual hygiene. So the question does not, and it just not like, anything in the non-legal profession, even who are law students, who are girls, they don't know what their reproductive rights are. They don't talk about that. And there is still much taboo and struggle to make them realize that this is your body. You have to protect it. This is who you are accountable for, and you will have to be vocal about it. Like, it takes so much, I can say, struggle or effort to make them understand this thing.
The issue gets much more complex when we're talking about mental disabilities, because right now you're saying that you need to speak about it. Firstly, you do not have the knowledge and information to speak about it. That makes it complex. And then if you have a mental disability, then nobody even cares to even get an informed consent. So we'll come to that aspect as well, how to get a consent, and if at all there's a mechanism, or we can come up with certain principles to get such consent. That can also be useful when it comes to any sort of intrusive, treatment, that institutionalized treatment, intrusive treatment on people with mental disabilities. I think that has been an issue for long. So all these are overlapping issues, and we will be talking about the principles underlying them, right? Underlying the solution. So I'll focus more on the solution than the problem, because I think by and large, we've understood it's a violation of integrity of the person. It has been recognized as a violation by international bodies. Even in India, we have cases, we'll come to that, where it has been recognized as a violation of integrity of the person, violation of right to health, every woman has the right to make a reproductive choice, whether she wants to get pregnant, when she wants to get pregnant, and whether at all she would want to
get pregnant.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So again, we have also seen that it has been used. Rome Statute also categorically says that forced sterilization, when it's committed, is a part of widespread or systematic attack, and we've seen it happening as a crime against humanity. It can also be a war crime. So it can be used as that as well, and we need to realize that it's something that's happening and therefore recognized by so many bodies and so many statutes and international instruments. Human Rights Committee has also recognized it. It's a violation of people being treated equally by law. So it's a violation of right to equality, as well as it's also an unlawful interference with the privacy
of a woman.
Yes, and that has been recognized by Human Rights Committee as well. CRC committee has also done that, right? And in fact, Article 23C of the CRPD specifically says that person with disabilities, including children, they have a right to retain their fertility on an equal basis with others. So it's recognizing the issue. It's just that we are not talking about it in as many words. In fact, we are not talking about disability issues as well.
Retain the fertility.
Yes, retain the
fertility. Something I was not aware about.
And the background is that, forced sterilization has been happening. And I think every woman with disability is prone to, whoever has a difficulty in, say, a locomotor disability or difficulty, has mobility issues, they are more prone to this, and they won't even talk about it, right? So to even get that they were sterilized without their consent, it's a difficult information to even get, right? Right. So now let's look at what does our law say about it, as in Rights of Persons with Disabilities Act. We just saw CRPD, Convention on Right to Persons with Disabilities, that says that everyone has a right to retain their fertility, right? It also says that they enjoy equal legal capacity. Even Indian law recognizes that. Rights of Persons with Disabilities Act 2016 recognizes that persons with
so sorry to interrupt you. We have a request from an attendee that could you please go a little slow about it, since he's making notes. So that might help him noting on the pace of your conversation.
Sure, I'm so happy that you're making notes, because I really enjoy talking about this topic. Not many people know I had the opportunity of arguing before the Supreme Court recently on Disability Act, and trust me, we still have to talk a lot about it.
A lot about it,
because there's even we do not know the bare provisions of the Act. So I think we can also have separate sessions on rights of persons with disabilities, or just some aspect of disability on another occasion, because there's so much to be covered on this aspect. Right. So firstly, persons with disabilities enjoy legal capacity on an equal basis with others. This has been recognized by the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, as well as the Indian Act, which is the Rights of Persons with Disabilities Act 2016. Section 13 of the Act recognizes that. What does it mean? The implication of it would be if a person with disability has equal legal capacity. And this phrase is very important, on an equal basis with others. So it's not just having legal capacity, it has to be on an equal basis with others, right? They have right to equal recognition before the law everywhere, as any other person has. Also, so what is the implication of enjoying legal capacity? It means you have a right to give your consent. you have a right to autonomy.
Considered the most important instrument here.
Yes, something that was denied may not have been in as many words, but autonomy has always been compromised when it comes to people with disabilities. Just like children, you don't think that they have a say in their own matters. Similarly, with persons with disabilities, people thought they cannot decide for themselves, so let's decide for them. Everyone has a right to decide for them. That's how it is. So this act, in as many words, recognizes their right to make their own decisions by saying that they enjoy equal legal capacity. They have equal recognition, they have rights to recognition of the law, something that even our constitution does not say, that there cannot be discrimination only on the ground of disability, but this act says for the first time. Then there's another aspect of it that Section 13 recognizes. Any person providing support to a person with disability, no matter what the disability might be, cannot exercise undue influence. The decision has to be
exercised more and more. The very fact of undue influence has been exercised, especially on women, in the name of integrity, in the name of reputation. That's how they are being convinced into the statement that, like, what is happening to them in the cultural context is very much okay, and they don't need to raise their voice because this has been happening for generations. It won't change for them.
But can you imagine what then happens to women with disabilities? It's way
I do actually. I do. I have encountered people in my own domain who have, like, they are disabled, and the very fact that they are not able to speak up what is bothering them, it's kind of heartbreaking. Like, there are very less people to understand them. What is the, like, the trauma that they are going through. It's very gut-wrenching when you interact with them, when you talk to them. It's not something which you encounter on a normal basis. And to the very fact that, to accept that thing and to be okay with it and to do something about it, I think, that can take a certain kind of courage.
Right. And even to the extent that their autonomy is being compromised, when you're talking about women, you realize how much it can be compromised. When you talk about women with disabilities, it's way, way worse. Okay, so the other obligation is that the person who is providing support has to respect, and this is what the law says in as many words, the person has to respect the autonomy, dignity, and privacy of the person with disability. Yes. Section 13 says this, that the autonomy, dignity, and privacy of person with disability has to be respected by any person providing support. Right? So this is the basis on which we can say what's to be done as far as forced sterilization is concerned. Forced sterilization is illegal. We understand that. Reasons, it's a form of torture, it's a sexual violence, right? So it's a violation of right to health, it's a violation of right to integrity of a person. Understood. Yes. Now, if we look at specific laws and what they provide, we also find basis in the RPG Act that says any person providing support has to respect autonomy, cannot exert undue influence, has to respect privacy and dignity of the person, right? Okay, so now the question would be, would RPG Act apply to people with mental disability? The answer is yes. And if time permits, I'll take you through I think I will tell you the definition of disability for sure at some point, because many people do not know what comes within the definition. And
legal definition of disability when it comes to defining it.
Yes. Would you want to give it a try, what you understand?
So basically what I understand, not in a legal manner, but more in a, in a layman terms, to make people understand. Any person who is not able to, physically support themselves, which hinders their financial process, which hinders their normal day-to-day activities, which limits them for, pursuing education, any kind of certain profession. I think that amounts a certain kind. And here I'm not talking about mental disability. I'm talking about physical disability. There are people with physical ailments who are like, disqualified from certain professions on the basis that they are not fit to pursue that particular thing.
I think you're very close to the legal definition as well.
Very close, not the exact one.
Yeah, but you're very close when you're talking about barriers. That's exactly what the Act recognizes. So any person with long-term physical, mental, intellectual, or sensory impairment in interaction with barriers, it hinders the full and effective participation of the person in society equally with others. So if any of these impairment in interaction with barriers, you gave some examples, other barriers could be communication, there can be so many kinds of
so many barriers.
Yes. So if in interaction with these barriers, the effective, full and effective participation is hindered, and not just when we think of a person with disabilities interaction, person with disabilities participation in society, we kind of do not put the standard as high as we would do for others. Now, the Act says that it has to be equally with others. If they cannot participate fully and effectively at par with others, then it is a disability, that impairment, etc., or whatever long impairment is a disability. So generally what we think is only the disabilities that are mentioned in the Act, or generally the ones we know. We are aware of locomotor disability, we are aware of visual impairment, hearing impairment. We think only those are disabilities. And anything that's not visible are not disabilities, or even if it's visible, if we have a certain threshold, right? We have a certain threshold and everyone has it. We have that prejudice kind of very ingrained in our the way we operate, that we think, oh, the person can do this, right? So even a person on a wheelchair may find it difficult to get down the stairs, but the person can do it. Or the person has, like recently I was arguing on scribe, on a student appearing for UPSC examination, in fact, a medical graduate, wanting a scribe because he had writer's cramp. Now, one had to explain in as many words to what extent it will be difficult for the person to write, whereas something that is a disability should be sufficient to get reasonable accommodations. So these things as a society, I think we are yet to evolve. And that's why we find so many, like the government had come up with guidelines that only persons with benchmark disabilities can get a scribe, which is very, very problematic. And the court rightly held that it can't be so, right? So, so physical disabilities can be different kinds: locomotor, visual, hearing, speech and language disability, and they can be of different levels. So it can't only a person who cannot speak will be considered a disabled person. Even a person who has difficulty in speaking would come under, if it, as I told you, the definition is broad enough, and rightly so, if it hinders them from fully and effectively participating equally with others because of those barriers, and they have a long-term impairment, then comes within the definition of disability. Also, something that I was going through the cases when I was preparing for this, and I realized that even the counsels who have been appearing in cases, they could not tell the court the difference between mental illness, mental retardation, and why we did away with, so there used to be term mental disorder, mental retardation, right? And now we don't have mental retardation in the definition of disability, right? We say mental illness is anything which is not a mental retardation. We say that much, but we have renamed it as intellectual disability. Just like we have done away with those terminologies as imbeciles and lunatics, idiots. We had those terminologies at some point. We had gradations. Or if a person is this much, then it's this. He's this much, is this. It was very, very indignified categorization. And that's where we have done away with all those categorization. And now all we have is mental illness and intellectual disability. Intellectual disability would include specific learning disabilities, would include autism, etc. Right? So it's important for us to understand that terminology is no longer, it does not exist anymore. Even the way mental illness is defined is quite useful. It's defined as a substantial disorder of thinking, mood, perception, orientation.
Communication as well. I think it affects a matter of communication as well. Anyone going through mental illness, finds it incredibly hard to convey exactly what they are going through. Even if, we talk it about the legal perspective.
Right, precisely so. But if you're just to look at the definition that the law provides as the basis for an illness to be called a mental illness, it's broad enough. And you need to understand that something that grossly impairs your judgment, behavior, capacity to recognize reality, or ability to meet the ordinary demands of life.
Right.
It does not include retardation, right, which is a condition of arrested or incomplete development of mind of a person, especially characterized with subnormality of intelligence. So that's intellectual disability. And mental illness would be anything that is impairing your judgment, that is a substantial disorder of thinking, mood, perception, etc. So it's that broad. And I think it's important for us to recognize that that's what it is. It's nothing more, nothing less, right? It's not a mad person, that categorization of lunatic. It's not, no longer, it doesn't exist. It's not recognized. It's not a recognized way of addressing or thinking about a person for that matter, right? And then there's a separate category of disability caused due to chronic neurological conditions and blood disorder. So again, it's a separate category. It doesn't come with mental illness. Some people think all neurological conditions come with mental illness. Right? And then you have in the category of multiple disabilities. Now, how many of you have heard deaf blindness? You haven't. So once I was wanting to make something accessible. We were doing a webinar series on disability, and I said we also need transcript, right? And people were like, "Oh, we have sign language interpreter. Why do we need transcript?" So we were and this was a blind person saying it. We had completely forgotten that there could be people who have deaf blindness. So anyhow, coming back to the topic, so let's see what Right of Persons with Disabilities Act talks about in terms of getting consent, right? So there could be people it could be any of these disabilities where people's ability to consent may be compromised. In that case, how do you get consent? So it talks about limited guardianship concept, right? So earlier we see the act relating to, so you have National Trust Act. So you have act that talks about what to do in cases where someone is suffering from cerebral palsy, autism, etc., or multiple disabilities. What to do in these circumstances is you appoint a guardian who takes care, who decides for them, was something that was very valid, legitimate way of looking at it on how to get a consent. You don't get a consent from that person. You have a person who decides for that person. And then that guardian can be removed by this person, etc. But to a limited extent, they have a right to remove, but they still do not have a right to decide.
Right, because the person is not of sound mind to take that decision, take such decisions. That's why the guardian is appointed to make sure the decisions that are being taken, are in the reasonability of the context.
So you made an important point, person is not of sound mind. Now, cerebral palsy, I have friends with cerebral palsy, they are of sound mind, autistic, to some extent, they can decide for themselves what they want to eat, what they don't want, what they want in life, etc. So to what extent can you have a guardian to decide everything for them? Right? So therefore, the RPD Act has introduced the concept of limited guardianship. So what it says is a person with disability who has been provided adequate and appropriate support, but is unable to take legally binding decisions, right? So you've provided him all sorts of adequate and appropriate support, but the person cannot take legally binding decisions. Then they can be provided further support, and then the court can, for example, appoint a limited guardian to take legally binding decisions on his behalf in consultation with such person. This is important, right? So there's a concept of limited guardianship here. Okay, so the definition of limited guardianship under this act is it's a system of joint decision which operates on mutual understanding. Mutual understanding and trust between the guardian and the person with disability. You realize suddenly a person with disability has an agency that's recognized by the act, by the law, and then this limited guardianship shall be limited. That's why we use the word limited before guardianship. It shall be limited to a specific period and for specific decision and situation, right? So person can decide what to eat, for example, may not decide whether to sell off a property. So therefore, for specific decision and situation, and shall operate in accordance to the will of the person. So I think this definition is very important, even when we are thinking in terms of forced sterilization. This is very important. This is how you get consent, even of a person who cannot decide for themselves. This is how you get their informed consent. And this whole regime of informed consent, I think, is something that's not known by many people, not known by social workers. For example, I was attending a workshop in the UK on it was called autonomy workshop or something, and I was sitting in a room full of social workers who work with women, who work with people with disabilities, and they had no idea about informed consent. They really thought that they could decide for people what they wanted, or their guardians, whatever the caregivers said, they were supposed to do it, etc. So, in fact, people who, this was a time when convention was already there, and the UK law had just been amended. So, even in the UK, people had no idea. And they thought that they knew about the amendment. The problem is the way society evolves is different. It's
implementation
altogether, right? And so they were like, oh, the convention is not in line with the UK law. And I was so troubled by the notion. I tried to speak, and they were like, oh, human rights people talk like that. So finally, I was like, you know what? I need to explain to you what the convention is and what it's meant to do. And when I started addressing them, they really got my point. So it's always important to understand with the help of the underlying principles. Other than if you don't do it that way, it may all seem to be an imposition of some sort that's not possible to be implemented, or that should not be implemented. Right? So there's always resistance towards a new law. Therefore, you need to understand why it has come into existence in the first place.
All right.
Perfect. So also, if we have to look at, now we are discussing the laws, and therefore let's look at Medical Termination of Pregnancy Act as well, if that's
a very important one.
Right. So yes, Section 3, subsection 4 does say that a pregnancy of a woman who has attained 18 years cannot be terminated. But there are two exceptions. Of course, one, I told you that it must have attained 18 years, then you need consent. The other exception would be in cases of mentally ill person, with the consent of the guardian, it can be terminated, is what
so recently, I think about 2 years back, I came across an MP High Court judgment. In fact, it was not a judgment, it was a case in front of me only. The girl has been raped. It was a section under 376, and she was of 16 years old. And I think the pregnancy was more than for 12 weeks. I think it was for 16 weeks, in which medically it does not permit, that the pregnancy cannot be terminated. But an urgent order by the High Court judge, wherein it has to be terminated because the girl was not medically fit to conceive the child. So like, what are your views on that, since the Medical MTP Act comes into the picture, and here we are talking about a girl who is not like, adult, who is not of 18 years of age. So don't you think that like, the consent of girl is important here when it comes to termination of pregnancy?
Right. So there are 2 points here. One is, of course, to what extent so there's also a balancing of right with the right of the fetus as well. So you need to see what's the danger to the life of the fetus, and therefore you have that certain weeks criteria. Of course, there's the bill that has already been passed by the LawSikho, right?
Yeah.
And that is aimed at increasing the number of weeks, and so for certain women, including women with disabilities and rape survivors. So yes, so to that extent, it's important, and you are right, even for women who are below 18 years old, women with disabilities, for both of them, I think this is a very valid point, that their consent, informed consent, would be important.
Consent is very important though.
Yeah, and it has to be informed, it has to be taken in a certain manner so that they're able to decide for themselves.
Undue influence on them.
Right, not just that. When I say informed consent, so, okay, let's look at the definition of informed consent in the Medical Termination of Pregnancy Act. So it says consent given for specific intervention without any force, undue influence, fraud, threat, mistake, or misrepresentation, and obtained. Now, this part is very important. First part is like has a negative terminology, that it has to be without any force and influence. But this part, the other part is really, really important. It has to be obtained after disclosing to a person adequate information, including risks and benefits of, and alternatives to the specific intervention in a language and manner understood by the person. So I believe even a person below 18 years old is capable of understanding if it's explained in a certain manner to that person. So I think that's important, to obtain a consent in a certain manner. It may not be possible for the family to obtain it in that manner. In that case, there has to be a mechanism with the counselor, etc., who can assist the person, support the person in deciding for themselves. Right.
Perfect. So the important point to look into consideration here is a counselor can be appointed in such case, which many people are not aware about, especially in cases pertaining to 376, where the decisions are taken completely in consideration, keeping of the guardian, who's the guardian appointed, especially if it is a case of a minor girl. So here, like, the important thing to note down is like a counselor can be appointed to mitigate the proceedings, to make the person realize the what I can say, the consequence of the decision taken.
That's right. I think that's an important point. It all depends on how the lawyers choose to argue for a judge. Some judge, of course, we have seen judges like the Supreme Court, etc., who had that kind of understanding, so much so that even if the lawyer wouldn't have put it in as many words, he would have understood it. We have seen lawyers like Vrinda Grover arguing it in a manner so as to get the rape survivor, or to get a person, not rape survivor even, but a person against whom a forced development is possible if lawyers can argue it in a certain manner. And Sukriti, you've made a very important point there when you say that a counselor should be appointed. I think this has to be stated. This has to be a relief sought in as many words for when a petition is being filed. But again, the question is who is filing the petition, on whose behalf it is being filed, at whose instance it is being filed. Right. So if a family is pushing a person to terminate the pregnancy, then to what extent is it possible for the woman to make a representation before the court saying, you know what, I want support? So in that case, it becomes the court's responsibility. Again, we have seen cases where the court has said that we cannot. So if you remember, there was a time when even for custody of children, there was a time, and even now, the welfare of the child was taken into consideration, and therefore the court could step into the shoes and decide for them. It was like a substituted decision making that has been used even for people with disabilities, that courts have assumed as a patron to decide for them, right? But over a period of time, this has changed, and we have seen the courts moving into the direction where they have also emphasized on informed consent being sought, and they themselves do not decide for the person. Right. So we have seen a case, this is a very important case 𝘀𝗫𝗃𝗍𝗃 versus Chandigarh administration. This is a 2009 decision. A bench of 3 judges, Supreme Court, held a woman's right to make reproductive choice is a dimension of personal liberty under Article 21. And this was a case relating to a woman with mental disability. In fact, the court used the term mental retardation quite often in this and said, and the best part about this judgment was, they said that even if a woman has mental retardation, it does not mean that she cannot decide. You can't outrightly say there can be different stages, right? And it recognized that the crucial consideration is women's right to privacy, dignity, and bodily integrity, and it has to be respected, right?
Okay. Ma'am, I think your screen is frozen, and could you please reconnect? Yeah, I'm so sorry. The webinar had to be paused. There's a network issue from ma'am's side. She will be joining anytime soon. Yes. Ma'am, can you hear me?
Hi, I'm so sorry. There was a network issue.
I understand. Yeah, so we were, you were telling about informed consent.
Right. So Z was the state of Bihar. That's the recent judgment, 2018 judgment. So I think we can quickly move on to Sanchita Srivastava is the case on the point. And then there's the case of Devika Biswas. That's also important. Devika Biswas was first, and then Sanchita came. Sanchita is directly on the point of women with mental disability. They also have a right to make decisions as far as making productive choices. It's a very important decision that say it in as many words that they have got the right to do so. And they also say that we cannot, there cannot be a substituted judgment there. There cannot be a substituted decision-making process. You cannot substitute. There was a time, for the longest time, we thought that we can substitute with a person who is, say, a friend or guardian, etc. But now they say, no, you cannot substitute. You have to take an informed consent, is what the law is. So now quickly, let's look at how to balance. So suppose there is a medical necessity that is calling for, or that seems to be calling for, kind of sterilization, etc., or in fact termination, since we are looking at both right now. Can it be said to override the requirement of consent for performing sterilization? Is the question. How do we resolve it? So it does not, right? It does not, just because you have a medical necessity, but then you need to weigh and see. So the test would be necessarily one of necessity and proportionality. So the kind of formula that I had devised would be, I told you when I was in school, since then it's been a kind of puzzle for me how to solve this. Therefore, I read on the institutionalized medical treatment sector of people with mental disabilities to find to what extent it should be done, because it's a medical necessity. Suppose a person does not want to be given shock treatment, should you force the person, even if you think it's a medical necessity? So the formula would be, of course, when applying the test of necessity, it will be imperative to determine if the procedure of sterilization would have been necessary, even if the person did not have the disability. That's important. So it cannot be, the factor of convenience cannot be the deciding factor here, right? So you have to see, you have to keep the disability away and then see if the person would still, if it would be still necessary, right? In other words, the disability either exclusively or in combination with other factors should not determine. Disability should not be a factor at all when you are determining if sterilization process is necessary or not, because if it's for the protection of life and health of the person, then it should be irrespective of the disability, right? So of course, the disability may be causing a kind of a medical emergency or anything of that sort, to that extent one understands, but to the extent it's only for convenience, I do not think that is a valid argument to make. The argument also finds weight when the term solely was dropped from. So you can check Article 14 of CRPD. So the word solely was introduced in it, then it was dropped. So it means that only such deprivation of liberty would be unlawful if the existence of disability. So even if the existence of disability is partly justifying an act, it shouldn't be done, right? So even if unlawful deprivation of liberty is on the grounds of dangerousness, care, or treatment, since it is based on mental disability, it should remain unlawful. So the ground of how dangerous it would be, if the basis is that, then it should be considered unlawful. It's my own opinion on this point. While applying the proportionality test, again, it is essential that the factor of disability of the person should not be affecting the decision, as any irreversible procedure grounded on the disability of a person cannot be said to be proportional. So there can be a medical necessity. Disability and medical necessity are not to be used as synonymous terms. The disability can lead to a sort of medical necessity. I'm not denying that, but it cannot be based on the fact that the person has a disability. When any is so, since it's irreversible, therefore, when you are using the test of proportionality, you need to keep that in mind that it's irreversible. Right, a therapeutic sterilization process. So when sterilization process is needed, it's a medical necessity, then the word used is therapeutic sterilization. Then it cannot be performed for contraception, because firstly,
therapeutic. I'm so sorry, I missed that point. What was that again?
Yeah, so there could be instances where it is of medical necessity that sterilization has to be performed, and it can be even for other women, right? Therefore, it's irrespective of whether a person has a disability, right? Sometimes a person may have a disability that may lead to certain medical complication because of which sterilization is necessary, just because it's a medical necessity. In that case, the term used is therapeutic sterilization. But in the name of therapeutic sterilization, quite often it's just done because person has a disability. That in itself should not justify sterilization. Is the point I'm trying to make here, right? So again, when you're balancing it, it's important. So you can take examples of, say, force feeding, right? Forced feeding, why is it justified? When a person is, it's against the wishes of the person. Some people may say it's not, but then what do you balance it with? So therefore, even here, even in the apps, so there it's against the wishes of a person to keep that person alive. Here, even the consent of the woman is not being taken, therefore it cannot be justified in any manner, right? So therefore, the best possible way of balancing it would be to take the consent of the person. And therefore, if a person does not want to, for example, if a person does not want to go through a certain surgery, you can't force the person, right? The doctor cannot say, no, this is good for you, you need to do it. There is a consent form. That's the reason why you have it. Similarly, a person with disability should also get a chance to decide for themselves whether they want to go for a certain procedure or not. That happens a lot, for example, with people with hearing impairment, cochlear implant therapy, cochlear implant procedure. Some people do not want to get it done. It's absolutely fine if they don't want to get it done. Just because they're hearing impaired does not mean you can impose your decision on them. Yeah, so this is something that happens a lot, and therefore I thought I would bring this to your notice that it may be happening around you. So please ensure that it doesn't happen because it violates the integrity of the person.
Right.
Yeah.
So far you have covered the importance of consent, the sociological context of the disability rights, how it is legally dealt, legal definitions, and to make sure that, like, we are more self-informed about the laws that are being implemented. What are those laws, and how can we ensure that, like, we adhere to them, like, we can be more concerned citizens of the state when it comes to such things. I think that's all. Anything you would like to add to that?
No, I think whenever you are, and this is for students, for lawyers who would want to, understand this better, whenever you're dealing with any sort of right of a person, you need to see that you need to be able to balance it with, because there will always be counter arguments that what about this, what about that. Therefore, you need to be able to make your point, principle-based argument there, when you say that, okay, even when you weigh these two, this weighs heavier because it's the right of a person. For example, here it is even right to personal liberty is involved here, right to integrity is involved here. So to what extent can you go into the convenience of the caregiver? How so much soever you can relate to them, to what extent can you go into that will be an issue that you need to deal with. Yeah.
Oh, all right. So I think that's it. Any more questions forward? From Guardianship says that, can you please elaborate on the undue influence under Section 13 of the Disability Act?
Undue influence. Okay, so I can see another chat message here from Gauri Shankar. Let me read that and see if there's any connection. So would it be, as per the definition of disability, a person who is hindered from full and effective participation? So would it include mute, who can express himself or herself via sign language, as most of us do not know sign language? So yes, so one of the barriers is communication, and barriers, so the way we understand disability is very different from how it should be understood. We understand disability, and even Sanskrit, when you began, and we all do, we think disability means not being able to do something, and it's that person who is not able to do something. No, that's not what it is. Disability, and therefore people come with counter narratives. Oh no, you shouldn't think you cannot do it.
Absolutely,
No,
that is always there.
we are talking about barriers here, and we're talking about the barriers that society has. Like, for example, you don't have accessible systems around you. That's a barrier. And when I say access, it could be anything. It's not just a ramp that makes a difference.
It's mental, it's social, it's intellectual.
The fact that we don't have a sign language interpreter today, it's a barrier for anybody.
It's a barrier for
so
anyone.
Just because they can use sign language does not mean that the world is using sign language for them. Therefore, it's a barrier. Therefore, it's a disability. It's not their inability to do something. They can communicate, but you cannot understand, and therefore, it's a barrier for them, right? And then there are many people who do not, people with hearing impairment who do not know sign language, do not have trained people to train them in sign languages, etc. And then there's an additional barrier. If I start talking about barriers, it won't stop, right? So you learn sign language, but then you also need to learn English. You also need to learn Hindi. So when I have to write, I need to keep in mind. So I have to keep in mind so many things. On which group I can send an audio message, on which group I have to write in English and in Hindi, because you can't add then the burden of learning sign language and English and Hindi, Marathi, all your vernacular languages. Yeah, so there's so many barriers, even when you talk about communication barriers, so many.
So I think that's only one question we have. Anything, it's not like there. Anything you would like to add, ma'am?
Right. I think there was a question of undue influence, so that there was on undue influence. What was the question exactly? I forgot.
Elaborate undue influence, like what kind of undue influences are there under Section 13 of the Disabilities Act?
So undue influence, you would have read in contract what undue influence would mean and what.
In contract. It's more or less the same, if I'm right.
Exactly.
All right. Okay, so anything else, ma'am, that you would like to add before we wrap up the session?
I think I enjoyed it. I hope you guys liked it. And if anybody wants to say something, you can unmute yourself and say it. Yeah.
I think, the session happened quite at the scarce of time, so that many people couldn't join because they didn't know about the session. But I think when it will be later, accessible on the YouTube, I think many people will come forward with their questions, because this is a topic which is not much explored, much debatable, and people need to know more about it. That's why, I gave my input so as to make it more interactive, because when I was a law student, I read more about sterilization of women, which happens mostly in the Middle Eastern countries. I didn't happen to encounter much in India, thankfully. But with respect to Middle Eastern countries, there is much more topic when it comes to female genital mutilation. It was, as a law student, it was quite hard to grasp the concept, to know about the law surrounding it. But the situation there needs to be much more implemented than here in India. In India, we also need to talk about these things. But I think around the globe, I think women's rights, especially when it comes to consent, is hugely misinterpreted in the society. People don't understand what basically consent means. So I think that's what I only wanted to convey, and I hope I was a useful moderator for the session. You very effectively conveyed the whole idea into the picture. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Sanchita. I really love the way you made it interactive, and it was so easy to interact with you, and it just added value to the session. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, ma'am, for coming. So I think